Welcome to Binge the Bible Bonus Features, a podcast where we dive into the crazy, unexpected, and interesting details that we didn't have time to talk about on Sunday. When you get into God's Word gets into you. We want to help you get into the Bible, understand the Bible, and apply the Bible. And our hope is that bonus features will help you do just that. All right, well, today I am joined by Pastor Kevin, who brought us the Judge's message yesterday.
Yeah. All right, everybody's still recovering from that, right?
Pastor Jason, and for the very first time, your debut, Pastor Barry, all the way from Leland.
From Leland.
Stamped my passport to get here.
Yeah, you both did. Y'all had to travel far. Did you carpool?
No, that would have been smart.
Yeah, we're from Leland. We have to both drive trucks over the bridge.
Yeah, there you go.
That's right.
All right, well, let's talk about Judges.
Let's do it.
I mean, we covered a lot of ground yesterday, Pastor Kevin. I feel
Judges
like
is a lot of ground. It's a lot of ground. There's a lot that happens in 350 years in Judges. You would think it would go by like that, but no, a lot happens.
Blink of an eye, if you will. Right. Well, some major moments that maybe we did or did not get to touch on in the sermon series.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's talk through it. So, Pastor Jason, let's go through the book of Judges, right?
Major moments.
Just go start to finish, like major moments.
Yeah, right on it. Yeah, and just jumping in, Pastor Kevin, I love the way you transitioned us from the conquest period out of Joshua into Judges and how it started. And from all signs, it looked like they would have had a pretty good inheritance. This is a great start. It's only up and to the right from here. And then we find out that the vicious cycle that takes over the body of Israelites from the Exodus even to this point starts to take over. Israel rebels, God disciplines them, Israel repents, and then God sends, in this case, a judge to deliver them. But once again, it kind of reminds us, I thought you did a great job of bringing it even to now. So we're just going to talk through kind of the major moments, and I know dive into some of the judges and talk through some of the stories we didn't get to, like the fun ones like Jephthah.
The ones that are fun to say. Weird. So I'm going to go ahead and give a disclaimer. I'm pronouncing Judges with a Southern accent. I don't know what y'all's excuse is. But have you heard the way that I talk?
Man, that's like
in the South, I feel like if you know a guy that's named Jep, his whole name is probably Jephthah.
Jephthah.
Jep. Is that right? Jephthah.
I don't know that I've ever met a Jephthah in real life. I also have never met a Jep, though, in real life.
Met a Jep?
Never met a Jep? You've not lived until you've met a Jep.
You went to North Carolina State University and you didn't meet a Jep.
I went to high school with at least 3 of them.
I was in the College of Natural Resources, too, and I didn't meet no Jeps.
Is that kind of like agriculture, too?
Yeah, everything about me screams agriculture, so yeah.
Is that the fancy way to say agriculture? We called it cutting grass where I came from.
My mom likes to tell people that I majored in swing sets, so that's nice. It's great. Right. Yeah, it's fine.
Good times.
It's fun stuff.
So Pastor Jason, you're right. Like coming out of Joshua, and I didn't read it yesterday, but really Joshua's really the closing of his time when he was giving the nation of Israel like the commission to go into the promised land. He really said, look, when you get there, you got a clean house. Like that's pretty much the way he said it. I mean, we kind of remember, that for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. Essentially what he's saying is when you go there, you got to make the decision that you're not going to be one of those people. You got to be set apart. You got to be different. And it's going to mean cleaning house. Mm-hmm. And what we see is in the beginning of the book of Judges, and honestly, we didn't spend a lot of time on this yesterday, but I think the very first sentence of the book of Judges, it's in chapter 1, verse 1. It says, after the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord. So they knew there was still ground to take in the promised land. But what they did is just before anything else, they just said, let's just make sure God's desire is first. And I've actually thought about it. Like when I read through the book of Judges, we see this slow descent into chaos by the end of it. And when I think about that, to me, the answer, the solution, like for all of us who are followers of Jesus, is how do we keep our own lives from going that direction? Mm-hmm. And honestly, I think it's in the first sentence of the book of Judges. It's like, okay, before we do anything, like it's why I think quiet time matters in the morning. Like before you tackle the day, what does the Lord want? One of the things I try to do is like take my calendar and every day just pray through my calendar and just say, Lord, what do you want to say to that person? What does this meeting even need to happen? Is there anything on here that's not on here that needs to be on here? And to me, if we can just keep our heart tender towards the Lord from the very beginning, it really sets the stage for everything else. And so I think they actually show us how to do it right. Verse 1, and then it all kind of falls apart. So,
Well, and they didn't learn the one lesson from Joshua. We talked over in the last episode of the podcast. We mentioned that the only real downfall that Joshua had was when he didn't inquire of the Lord before entering into a treaty with the foreigners. And so that was the only one lesson, and they didn't take that. And then we see kind of like between them separating through the land, getting separated from the ultimate vision of that God had for their people, separation from the Levites and the places that because let's face it, they were the main ones given the constant instruction of the law. They kind of held all that, and we don't see a lot being mentioned about the law in the book of Judges. So it's just cool to see that. And to add a little context as we're talking, Pastor Kevin, I mentioned this to you earlier today, but those last chapters of the book of Judges are considered like an appendix. It's just kind of going back, and it's awesome because you mentioned it. Your verse yesterday that you opened up with was the last verse of the book of Judges. You opened up with it and you closed with it because it's the theme. Yeah. They all did what was right in their own sight. And it's funny that because the author of the book, or maybe even like Samuel plus whoever else added that extra, they added it in last to give more story to what was happening in Judges and the downward spiral of Egypt or of Israel. So the chapters 17 through the end of the book actually happens between chapters 2 and 3. So just to give a little context that all of that is going on, all of that chaos is happening while we see the judges coming on the scene. Mm-hmm. So just kind of jumping in, Pastor Kevin, you covered like chapters 1 and 2. If there's anything we need to mention in chapters 1 and 2, I was just going to kind of jump in to the judges since we've got quite a few to discuss. And our time today be mainly discussing like this fun story of the judges and all that.
It's good. The only things to me that really stand out, again, chapter 1, when the Israelites are first kind of cleaning house, they really do that with that first king, Adonai-Bezek, cut off the thumbs and toes, like they take care of business with him.
Lex Talionis.
And then, you're right. And then if you look in the latter part of chapter 1, you actually see an outline of the way that fell off. And it starts in like verse 27. I think I read this yesterday about the tribe of Manasseh, but then it goes into verse 29 with Ephraim. It says that, so the Canaanites lived in, and I love the name of this town, this area, Gezer. Old Gezer. Like it says, so they allowed the Canaanites to live among them. Then you drop down to the next verse, same thing there. So the Canaanites lived among them. Drop down to verse 32. Same thing goes. Canaanites inhabited the land, for they did not drive them out. And you see actually this regression of them allowing more and more people. It started with one small group of people, went into 2, went into 3. By the end of that chapter, into chapter 2, you've really gotten a full picture of they've completely regressed from where they started. Yeah. So it's kind of to your point.
Well, and I think it's funny that they started to feel, well, this is a little easier than going in and having to conquest and having to wait for the Lord to speak and wait to move. This is easier, feels different, because I was just noticing in the countdown for how many years of oppression versus how many years of peace, like how long did it take them to start feeling complacent again and feeling like, well, this is good. This is our own strength now. We don't really need God. Because I've kind of said this before, if we're honest in our current culture and society, most of us, we don't really need to rely on God for tomorrow. We've got food in the refrigerator. Mm-hmm. We've got some money in the bank. It doesn't feel like he's there for every need. And so for us, it's even more important to remember that we have to decide to rely on God, and we're going to continue to obey and lean into the law. And I've always thought that's where they kind of lost the disconnect, is that little by little, like you mentioned, they start to give over. They don't feel that need to bring in the law and bring in being close to the Lord and inviting him back into the camp anymore. And you just see that downward spiral. But jumping into the first judge, how'd you say his name, Pastor Kevin?
Othniel.
I just like you. I can.
don't know. Is there a better way to say that?
I feel like we're on the same level.
So I'll tell you, sometimes when I don't know how to pronounce these, Google is my friend. Like I'll literally just let it talk to me. Like, how do you say that? And then I still get it wrong.
I just say it really fast.
Yeah, just say it with
confidence.
Confidence, yeah. I agree with
Othniel.
Right.
If I say it fast,
see, I don't say anything
tongue-tied.
fast. That's the problem.
But Othniel, I like him. I liked him just because I knew his father-in-law. I mean, it sounds like I knew him down the street, but his father-in-law, Caleb. I mean, Caleb is one of my heroes of the Old Testament because he was one of the ones that came back with Joshua from scouting out the land. He's like, no, we can take it. And then even at the end of Joshua, he's like, I'm still got enough energy. I can go and take that hill. I can take that land. And we see like he actually gave his daughter to the one that could defeat. I forgot the area that he had to defeat, but it was through the Lord rescuing his people already. But Caleb gave his daughter to Othniel. And then we see Othniel emerging as a judge for Israel. And it was after 8 years of oppression. And then he helped usher in a time of 40 years of peace, which is awesome. And just to kind of throw it back too, so judges, you told us they were leaders that were chosen by God to help deliver his people or to do justice. And so it was cool that not every judge we see like extends through the entire period of peace. Like some of them, they're just there for those moments of victory and stuff like that. It seems like from his story, it seems like he was there for the long haul. Like he was a leader for the long haul.
What's interesting too about him, it starts out saying about him that the Spirit of the Lord was on him. Like it's real, it doesn't say that about all of the judges, but it's real intentional about him. And I look at it when you talk about the regression of the book of Judges, and I read somewhere that and you kind of alluded to this, Pastor Jason, that the writer of Judges is trying to communicate what happens when you gradually drift away from, the best things of the Lord. Mm-hmm. And so Othniel is described as the Spirit of the Lord was on him. The last judge is Samson, who that's never said about. In fact, it's the opposite. He's a person who looks more like an enemy of God than a friend of God. And it even in the nature that the judges are presented. The first one, the Spirit of the Lord was with. By the end, this is the best we can do. You can tell it feels just that way. Even in their characteristics, it seemed chaotic.
Yeah. And I loved it. Well, and he seemed to be one of those guys that Othniel, speaking of, would have been the guys that he seemed to have had like that good stock. He was from the tribe of Judah, which they were the ones that were usually kind of sent off first. They were the ones that were given, like, I think the biggest section of land and stuff like that. But it says in chapter 9 of verse 3, when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, the Lord raised up a rescuer to save him. His name was Othniel, son of Caleb's younger brother, Kenaz. That sounds like a candy. That's like their version of Skittles.
You're doing pretty good.
The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he became Israel's judge and went to war against King Cushman, which, by the way, King Cusham-Rishathaim meant.
That's good.
His name meant like double harsh.
Oh, wow.
So it's believed that his name was given to him because he had so many conquests and punished so many different kingdoms or tribes or whatever, which is a cool thing that he took his people against this guy that had a reputation.
It's interesting how many names are given to people on the back end of their personality showing up.
I have people in my life that I like to give names to.
Right.
I have people in my life that they haven't. They just don't know they have those names. Like in my phone, it's don't answer or like talks a lot. So it's like, sorry, Carol. That's why I never answer.
I heard that.
Anyway, I thought that'd be good. I think that's a practice we should bring back. There might be some Ehuds in my life. I don't know.
Come on.
I'm for that for sure.
Oh, man. So, and moving on, you just said, is it Ehud or Ehud?
Oh, I hate Ehud.
I say Ehud.
think
You have to say it with your chest.
I think Ehud sounds like more powerful.
Ehud. No, it's like, you can't. Like, Ehud. Like, it's a powerful name. He's a warrior.
Dude, I can't get that much bass the way you do. There's no way I could say that like you do.
My name's Barry. So
I feel like less of a man when you say Ehud. I don't know how else to explain that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Let's talk about Ehud.
Well, and can I say, by the way, like I got text and emails especially requesting that we go into depth of his story.
Okay.
So you guys, are you ready to go there?
Go ahead, man.
I think we're ready
One of
to
my
go there.
favorites.
So yeah, he's one, and I thought you said that too, Barry. By the way, that was one of your favorites. Him and Shamgar, I know were your favorites. But Ehud, it's just awesome because he comes in on the scene like a little kind of out of nowhere. He does end up ushering in 80 years of peace, but after 18 years of oppression. So they're on the back end of the 40 years of peace that Othniel came into. But Ehud comes in, and again, we see the same cycle. Israel rebels. They start falling away, do things that are right to them. Displeases God. They cry out for help. And then we see God sends again. And this is, where I feel like we do have to kind of mention where the Old Testament does show God being loving and gracious and wanting to be with his people. Because a God that consistently sees this kind of behavior but will still continue to deliver and provide, even though they're not being faithful to the law. They're all going their own way. They're not unified as a nation, not as the 12 tribes, not as they were meant to be, but he still provides a way. And I love that he does that with Ehud. It says in verse 12 of chapter 3, once again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And it just goes on to say that they're at war against the Ammonites and the Amalekites. And one thing to keep, if you are kind of a Bible nerd, I would keep track of all the names like this. Most of the names that we kind of read over and don't really tend to remember. What's really cool about these is these are prominent kingdoms throughout the region of Palestine. These are kingdoms that the kingdom of Egypt or the dynasty of Egypt would have had working partnerships with. We see that in lots of archaeological finds. There was continued like garrisons of Egyptian soldiers throughout this whole time period. They were trying to reestablish strongholds in the area. They never did, really, by the way. They remained weak after the exodus of the Israelites. Just cool to note that. They were never the same kingdom after that. But they kept relationships because they didn't want to tick these guys off. They wanted a friendship so they wouldn't be constantly at war. But these are all of the bigger kingdoms that are around Israel. Also to the fact that these are also kingdoms that they could have wiped out initially at different times and never really did. So just take note of those names as we read through.
And they're names you hear throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Like they don't go away.
Yep.
They're just continually there, like causing trouble.
Yeah, and in our minds, we read it as separate, but remember, these are places that the Israelites, they would have partnered. They would have taken wives from these clans and tribes and kingdoms. They would have given daughters to these clans and tribes and kingdoms, so there was inner workings. But then in 15 it says, "But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, the Lord raised up a rescuer to save them. His name was Ehud, son of Gera." And it just makes a note that he was a left-handed man of the tribe of Benjamin. Just some of the stuff I'd studied. One of the cool things about the tribe of Benjamin is not so much that they were left-handed, but the fact that they were known to have been ambidextrous. So it's something that they tried to get better at. So he might not have been left-handed. He might have been right-handed, but had just been really skilled with his left hand as well. Just a little bit of information there. But the story goes, they're going in, to pay tribute to the king, which the Bible says he's a really, really fat man. We don't know how fat. We do know that for him to stand would have been kind of an issue for him because everywhere we see he's kind of sitting. But when Ehud says that he goes in to pay the tribute, and he's like, "I've got a message from the Lord." So he dismisses everybody because that would have been a big deal for them, part of the tribute. So he was thinking, wow, I'm going to get even more than my regular tribute. He makes an effort to stand, which is when we see the action ensue. And I don't know, Pastor Barry or Pastor Kevin, both of you guys are like you're ready to jump in. So it's just such a great story.
Go ahead, Barry. I know you got some thoughts on it.
No, I just love when you look at verse 19, kind of the second half of it. So he gets there to the king, and this is what he says. I love it. He's like, "Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you." And he's like, "Come and tell me. Everyone leave. Like, I'm so excited to hear this secret message." And then he kills him. It's so great. Like I just think, like, how cool is it that you killed somebody by telling him you had a secret for him? And like, I don't know.
And a secret from God.
Right. It was like, God sent me to kill you. But then I love I got to find the verse, but it says, can I read this? Is that okay on the podcast?
Sure.
Yeah.
We can
It's
read
in the Bible.
on the Binge the Bible podcast.
Cool. Sweet. I wasn't sure, So verse 21, it says, "Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. Even the handle sank in after the blade, and his bowels discharged."
That's a heavy.
I probably should have said, if you're eating anything, that would be a time to take a break.
This week in Cringe the Bible.
I was going to say, I feel like
it actually says it is his body fat came over the hand. Yeah.
So it says Ehud did not pull the sword out, and his fat closed in over it.
Right.
Well, and mention how long so this was they believed it was a dagger that was, they said 1 cubit, but we don't really know exactly how long that is. It's believed that it was about a foot or a little over a foot.
Yeah.
Crazy.
That's pretty big. That's
18.
And if you've any of my Brunswick County or Columbus County friends have ever practiced on an anatomically correct dummy with a knife, it's really difficult. Why are you looking at me like that's weird? Is that does nobody else do that?
Right up.
You guys, does
I
anybody watch?
Only practice murdering anatomical incorrect.
Yeah.
You guys don't watch
dummies,
you guys don't watch Knife or Death or Forged in Fire? Where they
don't
test
know
the
what you
blade.
But I'll add those to the
Let me
list.
say this: in the event of any kind of apocalypse, I'm coming to your house.
Oh, I've said
I got
that
a
for
spot for you,
years.
Pastor Kevin.
The bridge will be closed. all the
Bombing that
Wilmingtons are like,
bridge.
we don't go to the bridge. And then this happens, can we come over the bridge?
Leland wins.
That's right.
Oh, detonate. But I mean, it's really difficult to plunge a knife into anything, and so for this thing to go in a foot and then stay there is awesome. But then even the way because you got to think he kind of posed the body,
How?
bowels evacuated, sat down, and he fell over. because it's believed that his servants couldn't get in. They locked the door. He had already escaped, and they find him, and they think that he's using the bathroom.
Yeah.
And so it gives him enough time to leave and get his people and regroup. And
yeah, a lot of the things we read, like the entire knife disappearing, a lot of it is just the Lord giving time and space for Ehud to escape.
Yep.
Yeah.
And even the fact that he was left-handed, one of the things that I have read talked about how when you delivered a message to a king, you could only approach them on that side, the side that would give him time to, like, with that hand be hidden. And so it allowed him to do that and it not be seen. Like it couldn't be seen by the king because they would never expect it. That was the side of safety. And they would have never expected it from that place because most people were not left-handed.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting. The other thing that's not really Ehud specific, but for most of these judges, and we didn't get into this in the message at all, and there's, if you want to study history, you can study a lot about these specific kings, but typically there is a king that's referenced or a ruler who's referenced that sort of is the even more of the oppressor. So Pastor Jason, you mentioned how many years may go by while they're, not experiencing peace, but usually a leader or a ruler would show up who would make that oppression that much worse. Mm-hmm. And you can study them out and usually find out they were tyrants. Like, and it's not listed in the Bible that often, but in history books and things like that, you can find like who these kings were and what they were famous for. And just when you mentioned how that one king got that name, like it's pretty strong, the amount of pain that the Israelites were under. Yeah. And for them, how they were able to live, and this is kind of true for us in life, we're able to live with a certain amount of pain for a while, but then there's something that's a tipping point that usually points us back to the Lord. Mm-hmm. And it's a slow erosion. And then we find ourselves at this place where we go, I can't believe this is what life has become. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what happened for them. It's just over and over and over again.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the important things to note, and it's probably a good point to talk about it here, is actually the sovereignty of God. Because Pastor Kevin, I think that you mentioned this to me at some point during your preparation for this message, and you were saying that they don't mention the issues. They don't mention the actual thing that was used to oppress. They don't mention, was it, taking their babies like we see in Egypt? We don't know, was it, we know in some instances with the Philistines, it was them taking all the food and, forcing them into famine. But we don't know if it was battle, if it was slavery. We don't know what the issues were. We just know that they got to the tipping point where they're like, we can't take any more. We've got to cry out to God. And then he honors the request, sends a deliverer. But I think it's important to note that this is where we can really start to talk into God's sovereignty as well. Because a lot of people that have been listening to the podcast and people we've been talking to on Sundays, they have a difficult time grasping the God of the Old Testament because, they don't really see the love, even though we've mentioned that a lot of this comes because of his love and wanting to bring the Israelites back. We don't see a lot of that mentioned. But what we do see mentioned is Israel engaging in violence and even covert operations, as in the thing with Ehud. I mean, he basically was an assassin. Mm-hmm. And, we'll read some other stories where we see a lot of violence and a lot of difficult things to hear. And so for us, I think it's even more so important than some of the other weeks to read this, not through the lens of first world, 21st century America, but through like the actual eyes of what would have been going on then. Like, it's not violence that God is against. We've seen that he uses violence. Sometimes we see it's not even with anger. There's righteous anger. But some of these things we have to get past to the point of our first world perspective and see what was God trying to do and trying to see accomplished through the leaders that he picked. Because Pastor Kevin already mentioned, even with guys like Samson, they weren't necessarily men after God's own heart. Right. But he still used them.
He used imperfect people then. He uses imperfect people now. And I look at some of the violence too. Maybe my perspective is a little bit different. I look at some of the kings, and I think, what does that king represent? And when you do look at it from through our lens, the lens of whatever pain or issues we might be going through, in every single one of our lives, there's something. There's something that's an oppressor in our lives. There's some king, right, that's represented. It might be an addiction. It might be a relationship. It might be a spending habit. It could be a lot of things. And sometimes the only way to remove that thing is to remove that thing. Mm-hmm. Like you can't, honestly, you can't pray your way out of it. Sometimes you got to put that thing to death. Yeah. And it doesn't mean go murder a person, but what it does mean is you got to cut that relationship off. Yeah. Sometimes if you can't get your finances under control, you need to put them in the hands of somebody who can. Mm-hmm. You need to invite accountability into your life. Like there's some things that feel oftentimes like an encroachment on our privacy. And really the whole book is kind of this flow of, hey, you take care of you, I'll take care of me. And in the kingdom of God, I mean, one of the things even the New Testament says, like, it's not just enough for us to share the gospel, but we've shared one another's lives, meaning that we've invited not just friendship that feels good so we're not lonely, but accountability into our lives so that we can put those things to death that are just oppressive rulers in our own lives, because we all have them. Yeah. Like we all have them. Yeah. And sometimes if they're ever going to go away, it's going to take an act similar to this, right? Yeah. Where you just have to get rid of it. Yeah. So,
I mean, I feel like I always pitch small groups because, it's my thing. Makes me look good. Pat my numbers and all that. But for real, though, I mean, when you invite people into your life, especially when you have a basis in the Lord, it's so important to be able to point things out like that, I think, in each other's lives when you've been invited into it. Because we also nobody likes that person that's like, hey, you're doing this thing wrong. And you're like, what's even your name? Nobody likes that person. But it is nice to have people that can point you to the truth. So
that's good.
That's what they need.
Like it. I like it.
That's great.
So as we move on, we just talked through Ehud. Pastor Barry, you want to give us an Ehud again?
Ehud.
I love it because I can't speak with that much bass.
I can't do it.
I believe in you.
So moving from Ehud, we see the next judge popping up in chapter 3 was Shamgar.
Shamgar.
And what is it one verse? Does he have one verse? He does. A legendary character like Shamgar.
All the bros fave judge. Yeah. And he only has
and Pastor Barry, you have to talk about this guy because I know he's your favorite.
Yeah. He's my favorite because I can read about him the quickest. So, everything I need to know about Shamgar.
Your favorite verse, Jesus wept, too.
Yeah. That was the first verse I ever memorized.
I'm sure.
But yeah, so verse 31 in chapter 3, it says, After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too saved Israel. I just love it. Just in case you're wondering, he didn't just kill 600 people; he also saved Israel. But I remember. I think I was in high school. I read a book called "The Secrets of Shamgar," and it brings out 3 principles of like. And I don't fully know how this whole book came out of this one verse, but we'll go with it. It was great. But these 3 principles I've like used my entire life, and from Shamgar it says, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can.
I love that.
That's great.
And yeah,
The Secrets of Shamgar definitely sounds like the next installment of the Twilight trilogy or something, because that's not where I thought that going. But
Shamgar is just fun to say.
It is.
Even if there's not much written about him, it's just fun to say.
I'm still trying to figure out how to work it into like my conversation at some point casually this week, because you challenged everybody on Sunday just to work it in for bonus points.
Anyone who is
if I can ever get
bonus
points, that's what I want.
Yeah, anyone who's listening out there who can work Shamgar in at the office or anything like that, go you.
Well, I'd love to hear that story.
I've been thinking about make it not what it really is. So like, I was at the gym yesterday doing some Shamgars, and like, just be like,
so there are certain words. I had a friend in high school. He would make certain words omni-relevant, is what he said, and like one of them was cabbage. Okay, and so the word cabbage could be used for anything at any time. I think Shamgar falls in the omni-relevant category. Yeah. So next time you're at the gym, I was working ankles pretty hard and did some Shamgars. Nobody will know. People will nod in agreement.
I'll be like, yeah, good for you.
Is that a CrossFit workout, ankles?
It is. We work ankles on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Oh, and I do have to share a great story, though, because Pastor Jeff did a message on, what was it? Hello, My Name was the series. Like years ago, he did a message on Shamgar, and he had an illustrated message with a cattle prod, because an ox goad is kind of like an 8-foot cattle prod. And so he had an electric cattle prod. And shout out to Ty Guidry, who serves here, because me and him took turns cattle prodding each other in the back hallway. It
Boys
works.
Are very
Needless
different
to say,
girls,
it works.
like to say.
And the longer you hold it, the harsher it gets, and the more it hurts.
So for everyone who's out there wondering, what's it like on Sundays at a church?
Your offices
like,
be
behind
so
the stage?
spiritual.
Yeah,
do you guys just pray all day?
Right. What's
Close
going on
to it.
behind the
Something
scenes
like that.
while the sermon's going on or while worship is going on? You've got 2 adult men in the back cattle prodding one another behind the scenes. It's awesome.
It's a proud moment.
It's awesome.
Learned a lot. Great message.
Shamgar.
That really stuck
That's
with
good.
me.
All right. What's after Shamgar? We probably need to move on.
So moving in, Pastor Kevin, you did a great job covering Deborah. And awesome judge. But one of the things I love about her, first and foremost, though, is from the language we see in the Word, it seems like she was already in a pretty big role even before she was kind of called in and in that divine appointment of being a judge. She was already sitting and in judge of other different things. And so I love that. And you covered a lot of that. The biggest thing that my takeaway with her is the fact that she wrote a song. And not that so much that she wrote the song, but is considered to be one of the oldest things written in the book of Judges. So we believe that she kind of wrote that like as it happened. So it was discovered and kind of copied like as it happened instead of coming back later and writing after the fact. So that's really cool. And just a lot of wisdom, her and Barak taking on. Anything else we want to mention before we kind of move on? Because I thought you did a great job covering her yesterday.
The two things about her that stand out, and I think it's why I like her. So one is before what was not listed, before she was a judge, there are stories, history tells that she actually led worship services and preached like what we would consider a normal worship service. She led those. And so where I think the Bible references it is where she sat to like judge and like where people would come to her was one of the it was like her church. It was where she led worship experiences from. And so that's one thing. But the second thing, and you kind of alluded to this, the word that sticks out to me is influence with her. Mm-hmm. Like she just feels like a person of influence. She feels like, in my opinion, of all of the judges, she is the one that I would define as a leader. Like just in every capacity, she seemed to just lead the way in the way she spoke, in the way she directed people. She was very clear. People came to her. She didn't have to go looking for them, if that makes sense. And she was even able to go to Barak and like say, hey, you're a commander, but you're going to do this thing. Yeah. And I just feel like she was a person who seemed to have integrity and influence even before all the stuff that we hear about and read about in chapter 4 and 5. Yeah. So I really like her a lot.
I honestly think Barak gets a little bit of a bad rap wanting her to go with him to the battle, because it was a pretty popular practice that the prophet or the real leader would go with them, even though they wouldn't engage in the actual battle. They wanted, because they felt like God's favor moved with them. Yeah. So I always thought that he got kind of a bad rap asking her to go with him, because it was usual. I mean, it was typical. Yeah. But it is cool knowing that she said that, you know, the honor of the battle could have been yours. And then we see, what's his name? I always want to say Siesta, because Sisera.
I think it's Sisera. Yeah.
Like he comes to a pretty rough end.
He does. It's one of the best stories.
And one of the things that I remember just from studying a while back, like he went to a clan or a village that the Canaanites actually had a treaty with, and so he felt like he would be safe. And apparently,
right. Well, and Jael, I think is how you pronounce her name, the one who drove the tent peg through his temple. So that. Went to He went to a safe place, but that was fulfilling a prophecy that Deborah had given that would happen. So it's just, you mentioned the sovereignty of the Lord, and I think that's another one of those places where you just see that even in what would be considered a safe, sovereign area for him, the Lord still moved and stepped in.
And remembering that in that day and age, it was awesome for a woman to actually take it in her own hands and break the treaty that they would have had. It wasn't her husband, it wasn't her father. It was her breaking the treaty and taking out what she saw as an enemy.
Yeah.
So that's cool. And so we see from Deborah jumping in, we see Gideon. And to me, I feel like Gideon is probably one of the more talked about characters of Judges. And so Pastor Kevin, you kind of went through the fun stuff for Gideon, you know, being called in. You know, we see him with the angel of the Lord, mighty man of valor. And he's like, who, me? And he's hiding while he's in the wine press, like threshing the wheat, and which we're reminded at the time it was because they were in the middle of a famine, because that was how they had been ravaged, and he was afraid. In the tiny clan of Manasseh, and it says that he was the youngest of his family, so he saw himself as the least important, and we see him kind of answer the call. And I didn't know, Pastor Kevin, I didn't know if you wanted to go into anything there that we might have missed yesterday before. I did want to kind of talk about the back half of his story that we didn't get to mention.
Yeah, I think more time spent on that, because I feel like we covered yesterday really his calling, the way the Midianites had oppressed Israel, and what he was up against, the fact that he's the least of the least. You know, he's the weakest among the weakest person, among the weakest family, among the weakest tribe. And so to me, it's just everything about him points to he's not qualified. But what's great about him, and I think it's why, Pastor Jason, you mentioned he's one of the more talked about judges, I think it's because of his story. I think he goes from one of the least qualified to one of the most intricately used. Like the Lord uses him in some different ways. And honestly, all of the ways make for great sermons and messages and stories. So I think that's why we know more about him than we do a lot of the other judges.
Yeah, well, one thing I did want to point out in that early story was after, because a lot, again, like just like I thought Barak got kind of a bad rap, I think Gideon gets a little bit of a bad rap because everybody sees him as weak and afraid and maybe a little faith because he asked God to prove the calling and the anointing. Mm-hmm. I don't really see that because we see when he encounters that angel in the initial calling, he brings a big sacrifice that is, miraculously consumed in flames, and he offers that, which would have been really difficult in the middle of a famine. So that took great faith to bring that big offering.
Yeah, that's true.
And then also, whenever he kind of accepted the calling of the Lord, and this is before he talked about the fleece and all that. If I can find it, it says it was where Gideon went, and here it is. Verse 27 of chapter 6. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord commanded, but he did it all at night because he was afraid of the other members of his father's household, the people of the town. So just backing up a little bit there, to 25 is where I was looking for. See, the night the Lord said to Gideon, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one that is 7 years old, pull down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it. And, we see that his life was endangered after he did that. The reason is because that was an offering to Baal, and they believed that just like we believe that God stayed with the altar, Ark of the Covenant, like that's where his presence resided, they believed that Baal's presence resided with this pole. And so he was tearing down, saying, we are going to reestablish a covenant with God in this moment, and even if the presence of this false god does dwell here, he's not going to anymore, which is a big deal when we see his father standing up for him. So they didn't let the people kill him, and it was his own people. It was the nation of Israel saying, we're going to kill you over this foreign god that we don't even really believe in, but now we're in more danger because, our crops might not get, like fertilization like we're hoping for, and we're probably going to get ravaged again by another kingdom. And for them to stand up for that, it spoke volumes that they needed this moment more than ever. And so Gideon stood up.
A couple of things you kind of touched on there. One, the further we go, the more you notice the nation of Israel starting to turn on itself. Mm-hmm. Like the more that, and I would say that the more that sin enters the picture and becomes normal, the more that unhealth and dysfunction becomes normal. And like you just start to see that. And by the end, that's really happening. By the very end of the book, like that's a major, major thing. They wipe an entire tribe off the map. Like it's a big deal. The second thing, and you kind of mentioned it, and I even gave Gideon a hard time, for asking the Lord for proof. But we have perspective. We have thousands of years perspective, right? We know the end of the book. But if you're in that moment, if you're even look at the birth of Jesus in the New Testament, if you're one of the shepherds on the hillside, like you're going to be terrified too, right? You're going to ask for, I'm going to, even now, if like an angel of the Lord shows up, outside the house on Chalmers tonight and asks me to do something, your boy's probably going to say, okay, is this real? Can I have a selfie like to prove this tomorrow?
You would ask for a selfie.
Right, I would. Yeah, I'll hashtag it. Yeah, but really, it's one of those things where if you put yourself in the place of these people were people. Mm-hmm. They were humans. They were like not just characters in a story, and so it does make it more real that okay, this was somebody that the Lord did use. But the reason I like the way it describes him is because it does bring him down to our level. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we can look at these people and go, hey, they were already somebody. Almost everyone God chose was not.
Yep.
Yeah.
Deborah probably, I think she was. I think Samson was impressive, so that helped him. But for the large part, they were not.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, I think it's pretty normal that we would want some proof. Like, Lord, let me know. All right.
Yeah.
When it does, it sounds like Gideon believed in God. He didn't believe in himself. Which is it kind of I believe leads to his downfall. If we skip ahead a little bit, Pastor, you covered all of that story and how they beat the armies of Midian and saw like all the years of peace, 40 years of peace, kind of ushered back in. But we see them again kind of get lazy. And in chapter 8, verse 22, we see a saga begins, and it starts with Gideon. They've assumed all of these riches from plundering Midian. So they've gotten food back, they've gotten wealth, and so Gideon fashions. In fact, I'll just go ahead and read it. Verse 23 in chapter 8 says, I will not rule over you, nor my son Gideon was turning down because they wanted him to be king. He felt like God was their king. He said, I do have one request that each of you give an earring to the plunder that you've collected for the following enemies. So again, he's still collecting gold. They replied. They spread out their cloak, and each one threw a gold earring. They had gathered the weight of the gold earrings was 43 pounds, a lot of gold. not including the royal ornaments and pendants. The purple clothing worn by the kings of Midian and the chains around the necks of the camels. I guess also Gideon made a sacred ephod from the gold and put it in Orpha, his hometown. But soon all the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping it, and it became a trap for Gideon and his family. And then we see that ushers in the whole issue that we see with Abimelech in chapter 9. And, we see Gideon, he has all his sons, 70 sons. Abimelech was the son of a concubine that felt like he deserved to rule. He deserved the kingship that was offered, and he felt like was,
Well, isn't that what his name means? Is my something about my father was a king or something? Like Abimelech means son of a king or something?
Actually, yeah, I think it does.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
So it's like,
and he was he's the son of a concubine, which is interesting. I don't remember off the top of my head where what people group the concubine came from. I don't think it was from the nation of Israel, right? I think it was from a different nation. So what you have is an Israelite who's set apart in Gideon, marrying, connecting with, however you want to define it, a concubine from another nation who is not even his wife. It's an idea that comes from another nation. And what they produce is trying to set up himself as king over God's chosen, set apart people. And again, I think with every step along the way, you're seeing like how slowly it becomes this interweaving. Now you've had generations go by, you've had children live long enough to set themselves up in this, and it's so normalized that really what it starts to bring is more of that fighting among the nation themselves. Like you're starting to see like some civil war flow kind of rise up a little bit.
Yeah, well, and this is where, and your point seems like is completely correct, because the issue and the oppression this time doesn't come from an outside kingdom. It comes from within. It comes from Abimelech setting himself up as a king, which, by the way, he was only really recognized as a king in Shechem. And even there, as we see, in fact, Jotham was Gideon's only son that survived, that didn't die, and he wrote a parable basically warning the people of Shechem. They didn't listen, and we see Abimelech set up as a king, which later on they kind of revolt against him, and then all of Israel falls back into turmoil and oppression, and we see Tola come on the scene after Abimelech. And so we see that in chapter 10. Tola, son of Pua, son of Dodo, which I had to say that, by the way.
Great. I love these names so much.
Wouldn't you love to be the son of Dodo?
Yes. My girls would say that they are currently. They're talking about me, not their mom. Their mom's awesome.
good save.
No, yeah. No, what's interesting about Tola is, so Tola, if you do some study on him, I don't think this is super clear in the way the scripture puts it, but Tola actually he was a minor judge, which, again, we talked about this yesterday a little bit. It just means there are fewer verses dedicated to him. It doesn't mean what he did is any less important. He just probably handled a little bit less. But a few things with him. So one, many things that I read essentially said that Tola is one of the few judges, if not the only one, who didn't necessarily fight against warring nations coming after them, that he actually fought within the nation of Israel. Like he was sort of suppressing the civil war. Like he was the one who was fighting among them. So some people say, and some actually say, he governed rather than judged. Like it was a different, a translation of that word, because he was having to govern his people instead of help guard them against other people or point them back towards the law. And the other thing is that his name means that he rose, or the Bible says he rose to save Israel, which indicates he rose from within, not that he was trying to push people out or he was assigned. So all of the language just points to, and Pastor Jason, you were saying something about his name earlier that even points to the same idea.
Yeah, just through reading, his name means worm, which they wouldn't have read it just as like a worm of the ground. I mean, because for them it was the worm of scarlet, which is the cloth that was made for the temple.
Yeah, that's powerful. So again, when you look at the entirety of the book of Judges, you're seeing a regression. Right? It starts out, we're fighting against other people, then slowly those people become our people, and before you know it, the Lord's having to raise up judges because of oppression that's coming from within at this point. And that is just how sin works. Yeah. It just works that way. It starts slow, doesn't seem like it's a big deal. Hey, you take care of yourself, I'll take care of me, we'll live our own truth. And before you know it, from within, you're actually doing more fighting than you're having to protect yourself from on the outside. Yeah.
Well, it seems like, I mean, you see the progression from Tola even into Jair in verses 3 and 5 in chapter 10. it seems like every judge was reestablishing some kind of order, like some kind of like almost like a logical flow, because Jair, the big deal was like he established 30 towns and they were called towns of Jair. But that speaks to the fact that they were trying to reinstate unity, make sure everything wasn't quite so wild. In fact, a lot of the research that I was reading just for the history of the area, and this wasn't just from the Bible, this was like from other sources talking about the Palestine at the time, because of the difficulty in traveling. The trees were tall and wild, like the oaks, the cedars, whatever other trees, but that meant that the paths were really small. It said that even the population of lions was pretty large at the time. So it speaks to the fact that Samson would have encountered lions. David later on would have encountered lions. It would have been really, really dangerous to get off of the path, which meant that they were easy pickings for the lawlessness in the land, which all the bands of like raiders and stuff like that, just using the same language you used yesterday, that was legit. It was a really dangerous time to be in and out of that area, which was why like the establishment of like towns and people and flow and order would have been huge. And so we see that with the flow of the judges. And then we get into number 8, which is, to me, is the heaviest one to talk about, Jephthah, old Jep. We'll talk about old Jep. What you know about old Jep?
He's a judge in the Appalachian Mountains. Old Jep.
Jep sounds like he's from the country.
Right.
Jephthah.
So here, a couple of things.
Can I jump back to Jael real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I love that. Part of the reason I love this series we're in is because of how interesting like the Bible really is when you actually read it. And I just love that they share this. It says that he had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys. So like none of them had to share a donkey. I'm just like, that's awesome.
So with that, one of the things that indicates is wealth,
right?
And they would say it specifically for that. So the fact that he had towns that he set up in his name, that he had that specific thing, he was typically a person of like civic influence or wealth. And so it's just interesting how, like, I read it sometimes and do the same thing, like, okay,
it's comedic relief for me. I'm like, oh, cool, thanks.
Today it would be like, he had 30 sons who drove 30 Teslas.
Yeah.
Like, all right,
dude,
cool.
my kids are going to share a Prius or something. Well, actually, not even a Prius. It's going to be like an old school Taurus.
Yeah, my girls enjoy this bicycle.
Sons and they all got a bicycle. right. That's where I'm at. So.
It's great. So Jephthah, with Jephthah, couple of things to me with him. So, and I mentioned a little bit of this yesterday, but he was, again, one of those like least likely to be chosen. Son of a prostitute, had some issues with like stepbrothers, was denied an inheritance. So it's where I talked about the raiders. It's where he like teamed up with this, one definition was like a gang of scoundrels, which is just fun to say too. But he was actually one of those lawless people.
Yep.
And the Lord rose him up. And then the other thing that's interesting about when he was chosen is that the nation of Israel at that time, actually, when I've read what I've read, they didn't worship the God Yahweh at all. They were worshiping any god except their own. Yeah. And so it's when you talk about godless times, I think we kind of throw that around sometimes, like it's your godless times. When Jephthah came on the scene, it was legitimately a godless time. Like the God of Israel was not worshipped in Israel outside of like maybe some small homes or pockets or something like that. It was all of the surrounding gods. So it's taken to this point. Sin's crept in, and at this point, God is completely snuffed out. And so he literally has to raise Jephthah up to change the trajectory of how that's going in the nation. So
well, and again, they go back to probably one of the more least likely guys to be selected, to be the judge. Like the elders of Israel went to him specifically, even though he's like, he didn't understand why they were approaching him again. I've got to believe that he was somewhat of a charismatic leader because he led a band of rabble basically, but it says that he was a mighty warrior. But then if you look after he accepted the role of the judge and he went to the I guess like the bad guys, and he didn't initially like attack them. He didn't summon an army and go and attack them. He did it by way of negotiations. And if you read the negotiations, they're kind of brilliant because he corrects a lot of the other king's history, and then he gives him specific points that he can't deny. And basically with the law of the land that they knew, because the whole argument was about Israel's inheritance of the land. And so if a god had been deemed to win a victory, the winning kingdom still gets the land. It wasn't somebody else's by default because they didn't win their own battle. It would have just been understood, it's still theirs. Well, and then even if there was an inheritance of the land, that would have been understood. You know, whoever the first people to be proved were on the land, that would have been understood. So this even kind of echoes in the time frame for now. You know, Israel's claim on the land that they're on even goes back to this point. He was proving to this king that, yes, this is our land. We belong here. It was given to us by God, and it was won by God. Mm-hmm. And so seeing his argument forms, I mean, he's kind of a brilliant leader. And so it's no wonder like he had people already following him even before he was the judge of Israel. But, you know, we also see that he can be kind of rash. Mm-hmm. And so whenever he noticed, you know, he knew they were going to have to go to battle, he's basically crying out for God. And a lot of scholars do believe that he really did have a fart, not a fart, but a heart.
This is the cringe the Bible,
oh, yeah.
everybody?
That was my cringe moment for the day. Cringe in the book of Judges.
So what happened when Ehud
Jeb's
stabbed
fart.
that king?
Yeah.
Right.
But we see that he had a heart really to see God and the law reestablished in Israel, even though he wasn't aware, which leads me to where he made the vow. You know, he wanted to go into victory. He wanted God's presence with him. So he made a vow, whatever comes out of my house first, when I get back from victory, I will sacrifice.
And one of the reasons was, in his mind, it was common that when you do that, you're greeted with livestock, mm-hmm. not with people, like, because they tend to live in the same space as people. So when an outsider's coming in, livestock, my dog is this one. When I walk in the door, my dog's the first one to greet me, you know. Yeah. And so it's like that was normal. And so in his mind, he never thought, I mean, it's heartbreaking, honestly, when you think about it, because this is a guy who, right or wrong, like I don't even know if you can attribute any of this to the Lord or the lack thereof. It was just a bad decision, a mistake. Mm-hmm. But it was a mistake that he didn't turn his back on. Yeah. To me, that's the part that, even though it's however you want to look at it, it just leaves you scratching your head. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you just scratch your head.
Well, and a lot of the stuff that I read, because this is where like modern day rabbis, they would have loved all the extra tools to interpret the law, because that's the thing. Had Jephthah really known the law and been taught the law, he would have known that a human sacrifice is not honoring to God. And he also would have known that, you know, if he made a vow, he has to keep it. But this is where the rabbis, or for this time the priests and the Levites, would have interpreted the law, probably saying, well, if you offer a human sacrifice, God is not going to accept it. We never see any evidence that God accepted that.
It shows how, again, he was taking a part of the commitment without knowing the Israelite law. Yeah. And he was associating his God with the way every other God
all the
behaved.
Others, yep.
Yeah. Which is so sad.
Yeah. It's sad because they could have, now there are some like conservative scholars that believe it wasn't a human sacrifice, even though we do kind of read it that way in our English interpretation of the Bible. They believe that it was a sacrifice to servitude in the temple, which meant that she wouldn't have been able to have kids. So no kids. She was his only child. So his only hope of establishing more influence in the nation would have been children, you know, for his name to live on. And now he doesn't get that because she was a virgin. If she goes into servitude in the temple, she still wouldn't have kids, and she would have been made to stay there. So some scholars believe that was the deal. We don't really see that from a lot of the language that's used, especially when you get to the finer points of Hebrew interpretation or ancient Hebrew. I don't read ancient Hebrew, so if you guys do, feel free to chime in.
But, I mean, not this week. I did a little bit.
We'll come back next week.
One thing that I read, and I don't remember if it made it clear if this is still a tradition or if it was just a tradition for a while, but there's actually an annual thing where a young Israelite woman would basically leave for 4 days to commemorate his daughter. So a way that they kind of kept her memory alive was this like annual thing that they did. And but it's still, it's heartbreaking when you think about the way that happened. So after Jephthah, we have kind of the grouping of three judges, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. And these are the guys, yesterday when I referenced them, they take up maybe about 5 verses of the Bible. When you look at Judges chapter 12, really their story starts in verse 8. They don't have a lot that it really outlines that they did. I mean, there's obviously some things, but the biggest thing that it highlights about them, Pastor Barry, you mentioned earlier the guy that had like 30 sons and 30 donkeys. Mm-hmm. This highlights again for them the amount of children that they had. And one had 30 sons and 30 daughters. And it actually says about him, that's Ibzan, that he made a point of marrying all of them outside of his tribe, which is just interesting to me. And one commentary says that was for him, it was an intentional way for him to extend his influence. So again, he's kind of a strategic type leader. It's one of the things you can take away from that. And it may have even helped bring peace. Pastor Jason, you mentioned political leadership earlier, and I think Ibsen was probably that kind of judge. And then you go down through the rest of them. Another one of them, I think it's Abdon, had 40 sons and 30 grandsons, and it mentions that they rode on 70 donkeys. So I made the joke yesterday, those two are the ones from Leland. So if you're listening to this and you're not from around the Wilmington area, in Leland, they like to obviously stab anatomically correct
that's the fun.
dummies,
Some people
you know.
in Leland do that.
And then
Everyone in Leland.
they like to procreate in Leland. So
They took
yeah.
that
7
verse,
kids on that side of the
be
table
fruitful and
represented.
multiply.
Right.
They took that literal.
Yes. So yeah, if you're watching this on video,
Two
7
kids on
children.
the Pine Valley side.
2 children
7.
right here. 7 children right
High
here.
five.
Hey.
So, all right, good times.
Oh, it's good
Is
stuff.
this where Tesla was created? The Old Testament?
Elon. Yeah.
Elon, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
It's a bad joke.
That's it.
Cool.
Twitter
We
and
needed at
Tesla.
least one dad joke. At least one.
That's
Okay.
good.
That gets the award.
Yeah.
So
Samson.
then that brings us to
Samson.
the most popular of the judges,
Oh.
Samson.
And it's 'cause
Pastor
he was-
Jason,
he was
talk
so
to us about
handsome.
Samson.
This is one that it's always conflicting me because as a kid, I had a little Samson action figure who came with a lion that you could destroy.
So we grew up very differently.
So
first of all.
I was going to say, we also grew up differently.
well,
than
that came
y'all
from the
did.
Totally
Christian
different.
bookstore. That toy came from the Christian bookstore in
I
my
had a
town.
Stretch Armstrong. Is this the same thing?
Well, and it was a little disturbing because my Samson, he just had a loincloth and his arms were perpetually like up in the air with his biceps flexed.
So that was He-Man at my house.
yeah.
Same thing.
He-Man was evil.
I had a
though.
Hulk Hogan.
Samson was
He-Man was
biblical
evil.
judge. But I'm conflicted because when I got older and I found out like what a bad guy Samson really was, I didn't really feel like he could be a hero. In fact, Pastor Kevin, you've already said this, but he was like what Gideon was, Samson was not. And everything that Samson was, Gideon was not. Like Gideon was the least one likely to be chosen. He was a little fearful. He didn't see himself in any kind of way. Samson, we see like he had a big future in store. Even from the way that his parents found out they were going to have him was a crazy, miraculous story. And we see all these miraculous things throughout Samson's life, but he's not a guy. In fact, Pastor Kevin, you've already said it. You said it yesterday. You said it today. He appeared to be more of like not a friend of God, not a man of God in his actions. So just to kind of start in chapter 13, his father was Manoah. He's from the tribe of Dan, which again, one of the things I love about judges is that they point out almost every judge where they're from. And so it wasn't one particular tribe, like no tribe was showed favoritism. It was from the entire Israelite nation. But they weren't supposed to be able to have kids, and they were in that day and age. It was a terrible thing if you didn't have a kid, if you didn't have someone to pass things on to. And so his wife was out in the field one day, and she encounters an angel of the Lord, and he says, "Even though you have been unable to have children, you will soon become pregnant and give birth to a son. So be careful. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink." Isn't it funny how long we've known not to drink alcohol when you're pregnant? It's awesome. Great warning. Old Testament warning right there. "You will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and his hair must never be cut, for he will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite." And we learned what Nazirites were back in Numbers. "He will begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines." So at this point, he's marking the lifelong enemy of Samson was the Philistines. And I believe God's ultimate plan was just for Samson to wreak havoc in the nation or with all the Philistines.
Like physical punishment.
Yeah.
That's what he doled out. Yeah.
I bring the pain.
Do you smell what the rock is cooking?
But in verse 6, I think it's funny. His wife was so excited. The woman ran and told her husband, "A man of God appeared to me. He looked like one of God's angels. Terrifying to see. I didn't ask where he was from. A strange man pops up. I didn't think to ask where he was from."
The opposite of Gideon. Gideon's like, "Pardon me, sir."
Who are you?
Kind
Me?
sir.
That southern charm just...
Right?
But it says, "But he told me you will become pregnant and give birth to a son. You must not drink." Well, she tells her husband, "This is why I'm not partying with you, I guess, because I'm going to have a son." And so they prayed to the Lord, saying, "Lord, please let the man of God come back to us again and give us more instructions." So it is cool. They are seeking God. They recognize his presence. And God answers Manoah's prayer, and the angel of God appeared once again to his wife as she was in the field, but her husband wasn't there, so she quickly ran to get him because I guess that she was afraid he wouldn't believe her. And he ran back with his wife. Are you the man who spoke to my wife the other day? And at this point, if you're in the South, he had a shotgun in his hand.
Yeah.
But he said, yes, he replied, I am. So Manoah asked him, when your words come true, what kind of rules should govern the boy's life and work? The angel of the Lord replied, be sure your wife follows the instructions I gave her. She must not eat grapes or raisins, drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, or eat any forbidden fruit. Then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, please stay here until we can prepare a young goat for you to eat. We see a miraculous offering and the offering consumed. And we see that Samson is born, and he's already got this incredible calling. The only rules, they didn't give him like what job he was supposed to do. They didn't tell him anything about that, but they had already told him he's just going to be raised as a Nazirite, which would have been considered a devout life. Mm-hmm. And Samson's kind of the first person we see that's a Nazirite mentioned in the Bible. There were other Nazirites, they're just not mentioned by name that I'm aware of. But then we do see Samson come in on the scene. You know, he's probably a good-looking guy, probably a big guy. In fact, his name, Samson, is more than likely interpreted out of the Hebrew translation to mean son, like S-U-N. So that just means that he probably was like this bright, handsome guy.
It's interesting, too. He took the Nazirite vow, which is an external discipline that is meant to result in an internal sensitivity to the things of the Lord. Yeah. And Samson was the opposite of that. And it's, again, a mirror to Gideon, right? Yep. Who externally didn't necessarily have any of the traits, gifts, or talents, but internally was sensitive to what God wanted and was strong and courageous that way. Well, and so it's just it just goes to show, again, to me, the regression of what sin has done. Mm-hmm. That even though there's rampant sin, and even though there's a person who's doing everything right and checking the religious boxes, there was still not a tenderness towards the Lord in his heart. Right. If you go back to Judges chapter 1, verse 1, that they inquired of the Lord. There was just this sensitivity to let's make sure the Lord goes before us. Yeah. And Samson had the opposite. In fact, I would say there was not a tenderness towards the Lord or people. I mean, even in his relationship with his parents, I was going to say the exact same thing, because they even tried to keep him on track, because we see that once he's old enough, I mean, because of their proximity in the tribe of Dan, they were close to the Philistine nation. So he would have been exposed to Philistine women, Philistine men, but a young Philistine woman caught his eye, and he went to his parents, and they tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't have it. And so that's where we really see everything start to fall off. And it's almost like everything Samson did was in the exact opposite of how he should have been living, of what God wanted from his life, even to the point of, it says, whenever he finally did have the Philistine girl that he was going to marry, and he gave a riddle to all the people that were celebrating their marriage and all that, which he wasn't supposed to give riddles for some reason. I can't really remember why, but he wasn't supposed to give riddles or anything like that. And then we find out they did answer his riddle. He did honor the vow, because 30 garments or something like that. If they couldn't get the vow, they were going to give him 30 garments. If they got the vow, he was going to have to give them all 30 garments. And so we see there, he gave a riddle, which he wasn't supposed to. He lost, even though they cheated, he lost. But then to repay the vow, he goes to one of the Philistine cities, kills all the men, takes their garments, and repays the vow that he owes with the garments of dead men. So again, when you look at the descent, it's a descent into the solution is violence. Yeah. When sin is rampant, the solution always is violence. And that was Samson's MO with everything that he did. That was how he rolled. And do you guys do you have a favorite story that you're aware of with Samson, or is it just the whole thing? It's the jawbone of the donkey, because again, it's just, I think it's him almost looking backwards at Shamgar and going, watch this. Yeah. But then also it just, because the Bible says it's a fresh jawbone of a donkey, it's very specific. So he killed the donkey, most likely, took the jawbone, killed the people. It's just, he was a person of violence. It's the only way. It was his state of being. Yep. And I think it's symbolic of the way the nation was. Because next what we see is the nation act in violence. Their answer becomes violence. And I think it was he as the final judge, his state of being was what the nation of Israel's real state of being was too. Mm-hmm. Well, and we see the
he was conflicted all through his marriage. He was mad at his wife for giving away the answer to his riddle. And so he left. His father-in-law thought, hey, he's not interested anymore. I'm going to give her to the best man. Samson comes back, no wife. He's upset, and he blames the whole Philistines for the father-in-law taking his wife. So he goes and catches 300 foxes, ties their tails together in pairs, lit torches, and let the foxes ran through all the Philistines' grain fields, destroying all their grains. So he basically catapult them into a famine because he was, again, angry. But what we see through the word is this is kind of accomplishing God's will. So he's using a gifted, good-looking, angry man to accomplish his will. And we see that all through the rest of his story, even in where we see in verses 14 on down through the rest of chapter 15, where he grabbed the jawbone of a donkey, which he wasn't supposed to do because it was a dead carcass. He had taken the vow of a Nazirite. He wasn't supposed to touch anything dead. We see, and this is actually the second time. The first time we see him consuming honey from the carcass of the lion that he killed. Now we see him grabbing the jawbone. But again, God blessed it, and he destroyed all of 1,000 men, which is pretty awesome story, but still.
Yeah, right. It's just interesting, and I think it's why he's one of the more popular judges. It's why I think there's an action figure, because externally, he is like, it's impressive. I mean, what he did, like his feats of strength, so to speak, like they're impressive. And I think that as a leaders, our qualifications, those of us who lead in any capacity, when you lead your home, like you lead your family, what you can do externally may impress. Who you are on the inside leaves a legacy. And like, I would rather, and listen, we've all messed up. I don't think we're ever beyond the Lord redeeming, our actions and reshaping our legacy. However, the truth of it remains is that I think for all of us who lead for the kingdom's sake, anybody who's listening to this, you're looking at your life and you're wondering if it's making a difference. You may not have any things that are like these impressive acts that like Samson did that you just look at and go, wow, like they just impress. But I would just encourage everybody who's listening, don't worry about that. Yep. Like whether you have one verse like Shamgar or whether you have multiple chapters like Samson, think about the legacy between those two. I would much rather live the legacy of somebody that has very little in recorded history than somebody who, even though God used him and redeemed him, the legacy of him is not something that we aspire to. Yeah. Does that make sense?
And you even mentioned yesterday in the writing style of the time, they would have pushed the tragedies more than the hero stories, which is why I believe that there's more written about Samson, because his life was a tragedy. He never stepped into a promise that God gave him. All he did was act in the natural abilities that he actually promised his parents that he would see. But we see him fall into the same old temptations. Even with chapter 16, it starts out, he went to spend the night with a prostitute, and the Philistines were going to try to kill him then. Samson gets away. He actually destroys their gates, and picks up these massive gates and walks away with them. Crazy story to hear. God blessed him. But he was in the very act of sin. And then he comes on the scene later on. He meets and falls in love with another Philistine woman, Delilah, and we see her just kind of up in his life. He finally gives in and tells her the secret of his strength. She cuts his hair. He can't get up and fight. And this is, by the way, after he has given her the wrong things, and she keeps trying them. I'm like, my man, you don't understand what she's trying to do, and you keep like letting her do it. And part of me is like, maybe he was blinded by love. Maybe he was blinded by pride.
I wonder if it's not
maybe
arrogance.
It was a
There's
combination.
Part of me that feels like it's a little bit of arrogance there. Yeah, and then his story ends with he's blinded, and he's basically strung up between pillars at a party for all the Philistines to see and make fun of and mock.
Yeah. Well, and do you know what I see in that moment? I see his life being a representation of what we've seen the nation of Israel go through over the entire period of the Judges. He started out from a blessing and conquest, feeling good, years of peace and prosperity because, he won every fight. And all of a sudden, he finally gives in. He's caught. He enters into the oppression of the enemy. And now he's at his wit's end, because I love his last words. Samson said to the young servant who was leading him by the hand, because at this point Samson's blind, "Place my hands against the pillars that hold the temple up. I want to rest against them." Now the temple was completely filled with people. All the Philistine rulers were there, and there were about 3,000 men and women on the roof who were watching as Samson amused them. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord." I feel like this is maybe the only thing he's ever spoken in humility. "Remember me again. Oh God, please strengthen me just one more time. With one blow, let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my 2 eyes." Then Samson put his hands on the 2 center pillars that held up the temple. Pushing against him with both hands, he prayed, "Let me die with the Philistines." And the temple crashed down on the Philistine rulers and all the people. So he killed more people when he died than he had during his entire lifetime.
Wow.
And so his life is kind of just marked by tragedy.
It is. And again, I like to think about him alongside Gideon. We talked about that.
Yep.
This is nothing we've read anywhere. I think you and I were just talking today,
Yep.
and it was like, I think they mirror each other. And part of it is both of them are examples of potential. One is potential that was probably not seen by him, that God saw and fulfilled. The other was potential that went the opposite direction.
Yep.
I think Erwin McManus says one of the tragedies of life is to die, and on your tombstone it says he had a lot of potential. That we're given potential from the Lord to actually realize and live out. Yep. And he had all of it. And so, hey, if you've got a lot of gifts, talents, the Lord's equipped you externally, my goodness, like he's done that for a reason. Like surrender that to him and just see what he can do. And if you don't feel like you have any, surrender that to him and see what he can do, because either way, the Lord seems to be able to use the spectrum of that. Yeah. And it's just a strong story. Well, from there, it goes into what I defined yesterday, and we kind of talked about the nation, the book of Judges, and the nation of Israel's journey is defined from the conquest when they were taking over the land, to compromise, which has been kind of the majority of the book, into chaos, and it ends in chaos. And it's a terrible story. It's one of those stories. I've had more people say something to me since the message that I didn't realize that was in there. Like I didn't know that story was in the Bible, and I didn't know it was. And when you just read it, sometimes you can just read past a verse and go, "Oh, that's what happened." But when you actually slow down and look at the story, and the story is, in the quickest form, is that there was a Levite. He was traveling. He had a concubine. We've already talked about kind of concubines. Actually, his story is different because he had this concubine. They kind of fought, had an issue. She went back to her dad's house. And the Levite, it actually says there was a little bit of time that passed. I don't know if he got lonely. I don't know what happened, but he decided to go back and to get her. So he goes to the father-in-law's house. The father-in-law was not, or concubine-in-law. I don't know what you would call him at that point, But he goes there, and the father-in-law basically won't let him leave. He's trying to stall. So every time they would try to leave, the father would say, "No, it's too late. Let's have some drinks." And they would drink and get drunk. The next morning would be a hangover, and he would say, "No, it's too late to leave." And this just kind of happened over and over and over again until finally the Levite said, "We're leaving," which is why they ended up in Gibeah, I think was the area. And it was an area where the tribe of Benjamin lived. And the Bible actually says that they went to the town center, which would be a well. And typically there were no hotels, no restaurants. This was not a metropolis. It's a small, kind of a squalor of an area. And they go there and they would have to wait. And so at the well all day long, if someone were there, typically hospitality laws, which existed back then, would mean someone would go find the stranger, bring them into their home, which is high stranger danger kind of flow at that point. For sure. But they went all day into the night because that particular area did not want outsiders. Finally, a guy comes, they go to his house. This angry mob comes to the house, knocks on the door. They demand that the Levite come out, and they were going. We won't read the verses, but they were going to perform sexual acts to the guy, and they would do that because it was a form of humiliation. And instead of that man going out, the host in the home actually is the first one to say, "Hey, I'm not going to send my guest out. I'm not going out." He says, "Why don't you take one of my daughters?" And then the Levite says, "Actually, no, just take my concubine." And so it just shows the devalue of, and I actually read this somewhere, that when we live in a way that says, "Hey, we're just going to do what's right in our eyes. We're going to live by our own moral compass. We're going to live in a way that says, hey, you do what's right for you. I'm going to do what's right for me." The thing I said, the thing that I read said there were two things that brings to reality. One is that only the wealthy can do it, because eventually they're going to have to hire lawyers. Attorneys are going to have to come into play because you just can't live that way. But the second thing is that it said that those who are considered the weakest in a community, okay, are going to pay the ultimate price first. And I do not think women are the weakest, but in biblical times, that's the way they viewed it. And that's why for them, it was so easy for them to say, hey, just take the women. Like, they can pay the price. We'll devalue those that nobody else is valuing. And as Christ followers, what we've been taught, and when we're living free of sin and live with hearts that are full of life in Christ, we actually view the least of these as the ones we protect, not the ones that we send out to protect us. Yeah. And so it just shows like the brokenness of that time. And of course, the concubine is she's raped, she's murdered. The Levite comes out the next day, finds her there, takes her home. He's angry, right? And I went through this in the message. He writes letters to the 12 tribes, including Benjamin, and to make a statement, cuts her into 12 pieces and sends a piece of her along with these. What's crazy to me is that at some point, that Levite thought, this is a good idea. At some point, he and the host thought, it's a good idea to send the women out. And at some point, there was an angry mob in Gibeah that said, you know what, we don't like strangers. We're going to make a point, and he's going to go tell everybody else not to come here. That's a good idea. Let's go do that. Then, after he sends the letters, the nation of Israel comes together and says, this can't stand. Their governors stand up and say, hey, it's a good idea. Let's go kill Benjamin. Let's go get those guys. And so they go do it. They completely wipe the tribe of Benjamin off the map. They realize that was not a good idea. So then they have another bright idea. Hey, well, you know what? To repopulate, there's about 600 of those guys. Let's take some of our women that are young girls, really, and let's give them to those guys. And so through two just horrendous acts, they do that. What's crazy to me, what shows just the terrible price of sin, is that when everyone does what's right in their own eyes, when everyone lives by their own moral compass, when everyone has their own truth, somebody's good idea is somebody else's worst nightmare. Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think that it's the reason why when we find ourselves broken in sin, there's no way out outside of a Savior. Yeah. Because for every one of those people, it was a great idea. Hey, I got an idea. Let's do this. Hey, this is right in my eyes. Doesn't matter what's right in your eyes. This is what's right in mine. You take care of you, I'll take care of me. And so I think it just points us to the fact, and I really like ending the book of Judges with the idea that I think the reason Samson was the last judge is because they didn't need another judge. Truthfully, they didn't need another king. Yeah. What they needed was a Messiah. Mm-hmm. And he was the only thing that was ever going to be the solution. And for us, you know, I've had people ask, like, so what about us? Like, what about America? You know, is America just destined for this? And I would say I really can't answer that. I don't know that anybody can. What I will say is that in the book of Judges, it doesn't talk about the issues. What it talks about is the brokenness and the pain. Yeah. And I would say that for us, when we look at our individual lives, our corporate lives, our community, we have to look at brokenness and pain and realize that the only hope for that is redemption of a Savior. Yeah. And saying we have to go back to Judges chapter 1 and inquire of the Lord. Literally say to Jesus, break our heart for what breaks yours. Mm-hmm. You know, like show us in the battle that we're in against brokenness and hopelessness. Where do we go first? Where do we start?
That's good, yeah.
And so to me, it's just saying to him, hey, if you're the only thing that's going to heal this, then just show us what pain to tackle first. We're not fighting tribes. We're fighting hopelessness. Yeah. And so it's literally saying to the Lord, keep us tender towards you and tell us where to go first. And I think just one at a time. We just one by one, according to our own gifts and skills and proximity, that we just help heal broken things in Jesus' name. To me, that's the overarching thing that I take away from this book is like, there's power, but it's not to push out foreign gods. It's to heal broken people. That's great. So anyway, that's kind of my ending of the book, and my soapbox. Yep.
That's good.
We just binged.
We did.
We binged Judges.
Binged. We cringed.
We cringed.
We cringed. We binged.
Our cringe, the Bible is.
It's called
chapter
Judges.
17 through 21.
The end of Judges.
Some of all of the rest of them too, a little bit. Well, guys, I mean, I think we did it.
We did it.
Yeah, I think
Go
we
team.
did. Go team. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. We binged Judges. Next time, Ruth, we're up on Sunday. Don't forget, if you are a fan of what we're doing here, make sure you like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and we'll see you next time.